What if I told you that the fate of an entire nation once rested on a single dinner invitation, not a treaty, not a war, a dinner? This is the story of a woman who had everything to lose, her title, her crown, her very life, and yet risked it all with 5 words that would echo through history. If I perish, I perish. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. It's the only book in the entire Bible where God's name is never mentioned, not once. Yet his presence is so undeniable, so woven into every impossible coincidence and perfect timing that you can't help but see his fingerprints everywhere. This isn't a fairy tale. This is the Book of Esther, a true account of palace intrigue, ethnic genocide, divine timing, and one woman's courage that changed everything. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or wondered if God is even paying attention to your life, this story will transform how you see his hand at work. Let's dive in. Our story takes place in the Persian Empire around 483 BC, one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, stretching from India to Ethiopia across 127 provinces. To put this in perspective, we're talking about an empire that covered roughly 2 million square miles, governing dozens of different peoples, languages, and cultures. This wasn't just a kingdom, this was a superpower that dominated the ancient world. At its heart sat the magnificent city of Susa, where King Xerxes ruled from a palace that would make modern luxury look modest. The archaeological remains of this palace reveal courtyards adorned with glazed brick reliefs showing lions, bulls, and griffins. The columns stood over 60 feet high. The halls were decorated with gold, silver, and precious stones. This was a place designed to communicate one message: absolute power. Xerxes, called Ahasuerus in Hebrew, was absolute power personified. When he spoke, armies moved. When he gestured, empires trembled. His word was literally law. This is the same Xerxes who, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, commanded his soldiers to whip the Hellespont straight when a storm destroyed his bridges. This was a man who believed nature itself should bow to his will. The Book of Esther opens with a party. But not just any party, a 180-day exhibition of wealth, 6 months of displaying the riches of his kingdom to the nobles, officials, military leaders, and princes of all his provinces. For half a year, the power brokers of the empire gathered to witness the glory of Xerxes. When that concluded, he threw a 7-day drinking feast for all the people in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least. The text describes the scene in vivid detail. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Golden goblets, each unique endless wine flowing freely, marble pillars gleaming, couches inlaid with gold and silver, a mosaic floor made of precious stones. A king eager to display his boundless wealth to everyone in his citadel. This wasn't just a party. This was a statement of power, wealth, and absolute control. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was merry with wine, the Bible's polite way of saying drunk, he made a fateful decision that would change the course of history. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. The king had spent 7 days showing off his wealth, his palace, his power. Now he wanted to parade his beautiful queen before a crowd of intoxicated men, like she was another possession, another trophy to be admired, but Queen Vashti refused. The text is brief, but when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. We don't know her exact reasoning. The Bible doesn't tell us her internal thoughts. But we know this: she was hosting her own banquet for the women in the royal palace, maintaining her own sphere of influence and dignity. And she would not parade herself like a trophy before the king's drunken officials, no matter the command. Her refusal was bold, it was unprecedented, and it was dangerous. The text tells us, "Then the king became furious and burned with anger." This wasn't just irritation. This was rage. His authority had been challenged publicly, and in the honor-shame culture of the ancient Near East, this was devastating. The king consulted with his wise men who understood the times, his legal advisers who knew Persian law and justice. These weren't just counselors. They were the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and held the highest positions in the kingdom. One of them, Memucan, spoke up with urgency. Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, "King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come." This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. The panic in his words is palpable. These advisers weren't just concerned about the king's wounded pride. They were terrified that Vashti's defiance would spread like wildfire throughout the empire. If the queen could say no to the king, what would stop every woman from defying her husband? Their advice was swift and severe. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. And just like that, Vashti was gone, stripped of her crown, banished from the king's presence, erased from the palace, removed from her position, with barely any further mention in Scripture. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household. But here's the question: was this just a story of royal disgrace and a king's wounded ego? Or was this the first move in a divine chess game that no one could see yet? Because in the Jewish court of Susa there lived a young orphan girl who had no idea that a throne had just been emptied. For her, Vashti's story raises profound questions about courage, dignity, and consequences. Some see her as a woman who stood for her convictions regardless of cost. Others see her as a cautionary tale of defiance leading to downfall. But what if she was simply a piece being moved on a board far larger than she knew? The Persian law was clear. Once a decree was issued under the king's seal, it could not be revoked. This wasn't just policy, it was the foundation of Persian and Median governance. The king's word was final, unchangeable, irrevocable. This detail will become critically important later in our story. So Vashti disappeared from the narrative, but her absence created a vacuum. And nature and providence abhors a vacuum. Later, when the king's fury had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed about her. The text suggests a tinge of regret, perhaps even longing. But the decree stood. She could never return. The king's personal attendants saw an opportunity. They proposed, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all these beautiful young women into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This advice pleased the king, and he acted on it. And so began what appeared to be simply a royal bride search, a beauty contest on an imperial scale. Young women from across 127 provinces would be gathered, prepared, and presented to the king. The one who pleased him most would wear the crown. But this was no ordinary selection process. This was God positioning his pieces for a rescue mission that would save an entire nation from genocide. The stage was set, the throne was empty, and the clock was ticking toward a crisis that no one yet saw coming. In the citadel of Susa, there lived a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. He had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. This genealogy matters. Mordecai was a descendant of Kish, the same family line as King Saul. This connection will become significant when we meet the story's villain, because ancient grudges die hard. Mordecai was raising his cousin Hadassah, whom we know as Esther, because she had neither father nor mother. The girl was lovely in form and features, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle, a symbol of peace, righteousness, and divine favor in Jewish culture. But in Persia, she went by Esther, derived from the Persian word for star. Two names, two identities. One extraordinary destiny. Esther's early life was marked by loss. Orphaned at a young age, raised by a cousin in a foreign land, part of a people living in exile, centuries after their homeland had been conquered, the Jewish people were scattered throughout the Persian Empire, survivors of the Babylonian captivity, living as foreigners trying to maintain their identity while navigating life under pagan rule. Mordecai was a man of integrity who worked at the king's gate. This wasn't a menial position. Those who sat at the king's gate were minor officials, administrators, people with some degree of influence in the vast bureaucracy of the empire. They handled legal disputes, conducted business, and kept their ears open for important information. When the king's edict went out calling for young women to be gathered into the royal harem, Esther was among those taken to the palace. The text makes clear this wasn't voluntary. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. One day she was living quietly with Mordecai, and the next she was swept into a world of wealth, power, and danger that she'd never asked to enter. The young women were placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch in charge of the harem. They underwent 12 months of beauty treatments, 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics, an entire year of preparation for a single night with the king. But something about Esther stood out from the beginning. Esther 2:9 tells us, "Now the young woman pleased him and won his favor, so he readily provided her with her beauty preparations and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maidservants from the king's palace, he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women." Haggai was a eunuch who'd seen hundreds, perhaps thousands, of women pass through the harem. He was not easily impressed, yet Esther won his favor, the same Hebrew phrase used elsewhere in Scripture to describe divine favor. But Mordecai had given Esther one crucial instruction before she entered the palace: do not reveal your people or your family background. Esther obeyed. Her Jewish identity remained hidden, a secret that would become critical to everything that followed. In a court where being foreign could be dangerous and being Jewish could be fatal, Esther kept her heritage concealed. Every day Mordecai would walk back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was doing and what was happening to her. He couldn't enter, no man except the eunuchs could, but he stayed as close as possible, vigilant and concerned. When Esther's turn came in the 7th year of King Xerxes' reign, in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, she took only what Haggai advised. While other women likely loaded themselves with jewelry, expensive perfumes and elaborate clothing, Esther demonstrated wisdom and restraint. Esther 2:17 records the result. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti, an orphaned Jewish girl, a member of an exiled and marginalized people, had just become queen of the most powerful empire on earth. The odds of this happening naturally, astronomically impossible. The timing, divinely perfect. The king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. The entire empire celebrated the new queen, but Esther still kept her family background and her nationality a secret, just as Mordecai had told her to do. While Esther adjusted to palace life, Mordecai remained at his post at the king's gate, and it was there that he overheard two of the king's officers, Bigthan and Teresh, plotting to assassinate King Xerxes. Mordecai discovered the conspiracy and immediately reported it to Queen Esther, who in turn told the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The report was investigated and found to be true. The two officials were impaled on poles, the Persian method of execution for traitors, and the entire incident was recorded in the Book of the Annals in the presence of the king. It seemed like a footnote at the time. Mordecai had done his duty, saved the king's life, and the incident was duly recorded. He received no reward, no recognition, no public honor. Just an entry in a book that would sit on a shelf in the royal archives. But nothing in this story is minor, every detail matters. This seemingly small act of loyalty would later prove to be a pivot point that would save thousands of lives. God was setting up dominoes that no one could see yet. Some time after these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor, higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. The introduction of Haman marks a dramatic turning point. The text wastes no time identifying exactly who he is, an Agagite. This detail carries profound historical weight. It connects Haman directly to Agag, the Amalekite king whom Saul was commanded to destroy centuries earlier, but failed to eliminate completely. The Amalekites were Israel's most ancient and bitter enemies, attacking them from behind during the Exodus, targeting the weak and vulnerable. Now, in the heart of the Persian Empire, a descendant of that ancient enemy had risen to the pinnacle of power, and Mordecai, a descendant of Benjamin, the tribe of King Saul, stood at the crossroads of that unfinished history. The king's decree was clear: everyone must bow to Haman. This wasn't merely showing respect to a superior official, Zugis. The Hebrew suggests prostration, the kind of homage reserved for royalty or deity. Day after day, Mordecai's fellow officials at the gate questioned him. "Why do you disobey the king's command?" But Mordecai refused to comply. He stood firm day after day, while everyone around him bowed low. Finally, his colleagues informed Haman of Mordecai's defiance, revealing that he was a Jew, perhaps suggesting that his religious convictions were the reason for his refusal. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, the text tells us he was filled with rage. But this rage transcended personal offense. Something deeper, something ancient and evil stirred within him. Having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of laying hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. One man refused to bow Haman's response: genocide. This is the horrifying logic of pride, wounded beyond reason. This is hatred so consuming that it demands not just the death of the offender, but the annihilation of his entire race. Haman's pride couldn't tolerate the existence of a people who wouldn't worship him, but Haman was methodical. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in Haman's presence, to select a day and month. The lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Casting lots was a form of divination widely practiced. In the ancient Near East, Haman was using occult practices, seeking supernatural guidance for the optimal day to carry out his massacre. He cast lots for each day, for each month, methodically searching for the perfect moment. The lots fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, 11 months away. From Haman's perspective, this delay was strategic. It gave him time to organize, to plan, to ensure the destruction would be thorough and complete. From the divine perspective, though God's name never appears, this 11-month delay was mercy. Time for prayer, time for fasting, time for a queen to discover her purpose. Haman then approached King Xerxes with a proposal crafted with chilling precision. His words were a masterwork of propaganda and manipulation. There is a certain people, dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. Notice how carefully each phrase was constructed, a certain people. He made them nameless, faceless, easier to condemn. Dispersed among the peoples, he emphasized their presence everywhere, painting them as a pervasive threat, keep themselves separate. He weaponized their distinctiveness, turning dietary laws and Sabbath observance into evidence of disloyalty. Their customs are different. He exploited xenophobia and the devastating lie, they do not obey the king's laws. The Jews were actually law-abiding subjects. But Haman twisted their religious practices, their refusal to worship Persian gods, their adherence to divine law, and reframed it as civil disobedience. Then he sweetened his genocidal proposal with an enormous bribe, 10,000 talents of silver, possibly equivalent to 2/3 of the empire's annual revenue. Where would this money come from? The plundered wealth of the murdered Jews. King Xerxes' response reveals the casual cruelty of absolute power. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." The king didn't ask which people, he didn't investigate the claims. He didn't weigh the consequences. he simply removed his signet ring, the ultimate symbol of royal authority, and handed it to Haman with permission to do whatever he wished. This ring was far more than ornamental. In the ancient Near East, a king's signet ring was used to seal official documents, making them legally binding and irrevocable. A decree stamped with the king's seal became law that even the king himself could not overturn. This was the very foundation of Persian and Median legal authority, the unchangeable nature of royal decrees. Haman moved swiftly. On the 13th day of the first month, he summoned the royal secretaries. They wrote out all his orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the script of each province, and in the language of each people everything was done in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own signet ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. The language is brutal in its specificity. 3 verbs emphasize totality: destroy, kill, annihilate. The decree included everyone, young and old, women and children. No exceptions, no mercy, complete extermination. And as an added incentive for cooperation, permission was granted to plunder their possessions. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality. So they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. Then comes one of the most chilling verses in all of Scripture. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. The architects of genocide celebrated, while the city reacted with shock and confusion. Even the pagan citizens of Susa were disturbed. The Jews were their neighbors, their business partners, members of their community. This decree made no sense, served no clear purpose, and violated basic human decency. For the Jewish people scattered across 127 provinces, the news arrived like a death sentence. There was no legal recourse, no avenue for appeal, no escape clause. The decree was irrevocable. On the 13th day of Adar, every Jewish man, woman, and child in the empire was marked for death. 11 months. That's all the time they had left. But what Haman couldn't see, what Xerxes didn't know, was that Providence had already positioned a response. In the palace, wearing a crown she never sought, living a life she never chose, was a young Jewish woman whose entire existence had been preparation for this crisis. The enemy had moved his pieces. Now it was time for the queen to make her move. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. The image is visceral. A man normally composed and dignified now publicly mourning in the ancient Jewish tradition. Tearing one's garments and wearing sackcloth and ashes was the response to catastrophic loss. Death, disaster, divine judgment, but he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Even in his anguish, Mordecai respected the palace protocols, yet he positioned himself as close as possible to the center of power, his visible mourning a silent protest, a living testimony to the injustice of Haman's decree. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. From India to Ethiopia, across the vast expanse of the Persian Empire, Jewish communities received the news and responded with collective grief. Families embraced. Synagogues filled with weeping. The elderly who had survived exile now faced extinction. children who knew no other home than Persia learned they had 11 months to live. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She had no idea what had happened, only that Mordecai, her cousin and guardian, was outside the gate in mourning clothes. Alarmed, she sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Mordecai's refusal sent a clear message. This wasn't personal grief that could be addressed with the change of clothing. This was something far more serious. Esther needed to know. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai, and why Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He was specific, detailed, methodical. This wasn't rumor or exaggeration. He gave Hathach a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And then came his urgent charge. He told Hathach to instruct Esther to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. The weight of that message must have struck Esther like a physical blow. Her people, the Jews, the identity she'd kept hidden for years, was now the reason Mordecai was asking her to risk everything. Then Esther instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." Esther's response laid bare the danger. The law was absolute. Approach the king uninvited, and death was the automatic penalty. The only exception was if the king chose to extend his golden scepter, and that was entirely at his discretion, dependent on his mood in that moment. And there was another ominous detail. 30 days had passed since the king had summoned her. In a harem full of women competing for the king's attention, 30 days of silence suggested his interest in her had waned. If she approached him now and he didn't extend the scepter, she would die before she could speak a word. The crown on her head offered no immunity from this law. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this reply, and these words would echo through history, challenging every generation. "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" These words deserve careful examination because they contain profound theological and practical wisdom. First, Mordecai shattered any illusion of safety through silence. The palace walls wouldn't protect Esther when the massacre began. The decree applied to all Jews, everywhere. Her identity was known to Mordecai, and secrets in palaces rarely stay hidden. When the killing started, she would be exposed. Her only real safety lay in saving her people. Second, Mordecai expressed unshakable faith in divine providence. If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. This is the closest the Book of Esther comes to mentioning God, and even here he's referred to obliquely as another place. Mordecai was certain that God would deliver his people. The covenant promises demanded it. God's faithfulness guaranteed it. But the question wasn't whether deliverance would come. It was whether Esther would be part of that deliverance, or whether God would raise up someone else. Third, and most powerfully, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. For such a time as this, these 6 words reframed Esther's entire story. Everything, the orphaning, the beauty that caught the king's eye, the favour with Hegai, the selection as queen, the years of living in the palace. All of it suddenly had meaning and purpose. She wasn't queen by accident. She wasn't there for her own comfort or glory. God had positioned her deliberately. The beauty contest wasn't random chance. The timing wasn't coincidental. Every step, every moment, every seemingly impossible turn of events had been leading to this crisis, to this choice, to this moment. Your crown isn't just an honor, Mordecai was saying. It's a tool for deliverance. You weren't made queen so you could live in luxury. You were made queen so you could save your people. This is your purpose. This is why you exist. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. The transformation is complete. Fear gave way to faith. Self-preservation yielded to sacrifice. The woman who had lived by hiding her identity now prepared to risk everything to save her people. Esther's response contained several crucial elements. First, she called for corporate fasting. This wasn't just her personal spiritual preparation. She mobilized the entire Jewish community in Susa. For 3 days and 3 nights, they would abstain from all food and water. The text doesn't explicitly mention prayer, but fasting in Jewish tradition was always accompanied by prayer. This was the community crying out to the God whose name isn't mentioned, but whose presence saturates every verse. They were throwing themselves on divine mercy, acknowledging that their only hope was supernatural intervention. Second, Esther and her attendants would join the fast. She wasn't sending others to spiritual battle while remaining comfortable. She entered fully into the suffering and intercession of her people. The queen, who lived surrounded by abundance, would deny herself even water for 3 days. Third, after the 3 days of preparation, she would act, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. Esther had counted the cost. She knew the law, she knew the risk. She understood that approaching the king could mean instant death. And she chose obedience over safety, courage over comfort, purpose over preservation. And then come those 5 words that have echoed through millennia, and if I perish, I perish. This wasn't reckless bravery or fatalistic resignation. This was faith that said, my life belongs to God. If he has called me to this, then I will obey, regardless of the outcome. If I die, but I will not die in silence. I will not die in cowardice. I will not save my own life at the expense of my people. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. He gathered the Jews in Susa, and throughout the city, in homes and synagogues, the fasting began. For 3 days and 3 nights, the Jewish community of Susa ate nothing and drank nothing. They prayed. Though their prayers aren't recorded, they wept. Though their tears aren't described, they poured out their hearts to the God of their fathers, the God who brought them out of Egypt, the God who promised never to abandon his people. And in the palace, Esther and her attendants joined them. The woman who wore royal robes put on spiritual sackcloth. The queen, who lived in luxury, entered into the suffering of her people. 3 days of physical weakness became 3 days of spiritual strengthening. What did Esther do during those 3 days? The text is silent. Did she rehearse what she would say? Did she wrestle with fear? Did she feel the peace of God settling over her like a mantle? Did she remember Mordecai's words, "For such a time as this"? We don't know. We only know that When the 3 days ended, Esther put on her royal robes and prepared to face the king. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The moment had arrived. After 3 days without food or water, weak in body but strong in spirit, Esther adorned herself in the symbols of her authority and walked towards the inner court. Every step was an act of faith, every breath was a prayer, every movement brought her closer to either deliverance or death. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. The Hebrew word translated pleased carries profound significance. This wasn't mere approval. It conveys the sense of finding favor, of grace extended, after 3 days of fasting and prayer by an entire community. After Esther's willingness to die for her people, the king looked up and grace moved his heart. Was this natural affection, or was this the invisible hand of God moving the heart of a pagan king? The text attributes it simply to the king seeing her, but we who know the full story recognize that this moment of favor was an answer to desperate intercession. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. She was safe. The first hurdle had been cleared, but the real challenge was just beginning. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." This was the king's customary expression of royal generosity, likely formulaic rather than literal, but it indicated Xerxes' favorable disposition and his willingness to grant significant requests. The door was open. Esther could have spoken immediately, but wisdom guided her words. "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." A banquet. She was inviting both the king and Haman to a private feast. "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. The scene was intimate, carefully designed. The queen had prepared a feast for the 2 most powerful men in the empire. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." This was another opportunity. The king was asking directly. Haman was present. But again, Esther demonstrated strategic wisdom. Timing was everything. Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." She delayed again, inviting them to a second banquet the following day. Only then would she reveal her request. Why wait? Several factors likely influenced her decision. She was building suspense. The king's curiosity was increasing with each delay. She was creating the perfect atmosphere. By the second banquet, with wine and favorable conditions, the king would be in the most receptive state possible, and crucially, she was giving God time to work. And work he did, in a way no one could have orchestrated. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. The text captures his elation perfectly. He'd been singled out for exclusive honor by the queen herself, not once but twice. This was unprecedented recognition, elevating him even above the other nobles who weren't invited. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Even in his moment of triumph, one man's refusal to bow poisoned everything. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. There, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. Haman was ecstatic. This was the pinnacle of achievement, exclusive access to both the king and queen, recognition that set him above everyone else in the empire. But then his countenance fell. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. Despite everything, despite wealth beyond measure, despite numerous sons carrying on his name, despite power second only to the king, despite exclusive honor from the queen, Haman couldn't find contentment. One man's defiance robbed him of all joy. This is pride's terrible curse. It can possess everything and still be miserable because of one person who won't give it worship. It can achieve the highest honors and still feel worthless because of one voice that refuses to praise pride is never satisfied. It's a hunger that devours every blessing and remains empty. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." 50 cubits equals approximately 75 feet. A gallows so tall it would tower over the city, visible from great distances. This wasn't merely about execution. This was about public humiliation, about making a spectacle, about satisfying wounded pride in the most dramatic way possible. This suggestion delighted Haman and he had the pole set up. While Esther was prayerfully preparing to save her people, Haman was gleefully constructing an instrument of death for the very man who would soon be honored and whose people would be delivered. The irony is exquisite. The gallows Haman built with such satisfaction would become the instrument of his own destruction. But he couldn't see it. Pride had blinded him to the trap he was walking into. That night, the night between Esther's first and second banquets, the night after Haman built his gallows, something extraordinary happened. That night the king could not sleep. 5 simple words. But those 5 words shifted the entire trajectory of history. The king of the Persian Empire, the man whose word was law, the ruler of 127 provinces, could not sleep. Insomnia. Was it indigestion from the banquet, anxiety about Esther's mysterious request? Or was it something else entirely, the invisible hand of God keeping the king's eyes open for divine purposes? So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. The king wanted something to help him sleep, so he requested the official records, the detailed, likely tedious account of daily court affairs. And here's where the hand of providence becomes undeniable. Of all the entries in all the chronicles spanning years of Xerxes' reign, spanning thousands of recorded events, the passage they happened to read was the account of how Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, the 2 officers who conspired to assassinate the king. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Nothing. The man who saved the king's life several years earlier had received no reward, no recognition, no public honor. The incident had simply been recorded and forgotten. This bothered Xerxes. In Persian culture, loyalty to the king was to be rewarded lavishly and publicly. The fact that Mordecai's life-saving service had gone unrecognized was an oversight that needed immediate correction. The king asked, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. Haman had come early, eager to get the king's permission before going to Esther's banquet. He wanted to go to the feast with Mordecai dead and his own pride satisfied. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king commanded. When Haman entered, still thinking about his gallows, still anticipating Mordecai's execution, still savouring his anticipated triumph, the king asked him what should be done for the man the king delights to honour. Haman's ego couldn't help itself. His pride answered before his reason could engage. Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honour than me?" So Haman answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour.'" Haman described his ultimate fantasy: wearing the king's own robe, a symbol of royal authority and favour, riding the king's own horse, a sign of nobility and power, having one of the king's most noble princes serve as his herald, the ultimate reversal of hierarchy being publicly honoured throughout the city, recognition that everyone would witness. This was the honour his pride craved, the public worship his ego demanded. Then the king said to Haman, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested. For Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, do not neglect anything you have recommended." Time stopped. Haman's world shattered. Mordecai, the Jew, the man at the gate, the one who wouldn't bow, the one for whom Haman had just built a 75-foot gallows, the one Haman had come to ask permission to execute. Now Haman had to honour him publicly, throughout the city, using the very honours Haman had designed for himself. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour." Every step through Susa was torture for Haman. Every proclamation was a knife to his pride. The man, consumed by the need for recognition, was forced to give that recognition to his enemy. The second most powerful man in the empire served as herald for a Jewish gate official. The entire city witnessed the reversal. And Mordecai, the text tells us, afterward Mordecai returned to the king's gate. He didn't let the honour change him. He didn't become prideful or arrogant. He simply returned to his post, to his duty, to his humble place of service. But Haman rushed home, mourning with his head covered. Covering the head was a sign of grief and shame. Haman's triumph had become humiliation. His anticipated joy turned to sorrow. He told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." These words were prophetic. Even Haman's own family and friends recognized that something bigger than politics was at play. Haman had set himself against the Jewish people, and throughout history, those who opposed God's chosen people found themselves opposed by God himself. "You cannot stand against him" wasn't just about Mordecai personally, it was about standing against the people of God. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. The stage was set. Mordecai had been honoured. Haman had been humiliated. The king was curious about Esther's request. And now, at the second banquet, all the pieces would fall into place. The trap was ready, and Haman walked straight into it. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." 3 times now the king had made this offer. The repetition emphasized his favor and built dramatic tension. Esther had his full attention, his complete favor, and his willingness to grant whatever she requested. This was the moment. Everything. The 3 days of fasting, the risk of approaching the king, the careful timing of 2 banquets, had led to this. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. Grant me my life." The words hung in the air like thunder. The queen, the woman Xerxes loved above all others, the one who wore the crown, was asking him to save her life. The implication was staggering. Someone had threatened to kill the queen. She continued, "For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." Esther's words were masterfully chosen. She revealed that she faced destruction, but she also showed restraint and perspective. Even slavery wouldn't have warranted troubling the king, but genocide certainly did. She connected her fate to her people's fate. They would die together. And she used the exact language from Haman's decree: destroyed, killed, annihilated. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" The king's question revealed his shock and fury. Who would dare threaten the queen? Who had the audacity to plot her death, the power to carry it out? Esther said, "An adversary and enemy. This vile Haman." She didn't hesitate. She didn't soften her words. She pointed directly at the man sitting at the banquet table and identified him as an adversary, an enemy, a vile person who had plotted her death and the death of her people. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The text captures it perfectly. One moment Haman was sitting comfortably at an exclusive royal banquet. The next moment he was exposed as the queen's enemy, caught in a trap he never saw coming. Terror gripped him as he realized his schemes had been uncovered and that the king's rage was about to fall on him. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. Xerxes needed a moment. His second in command, the man he'd elevated above all others, the one he'd trusted with his signet ring, had plotted to kill the queen, the woman Xerxes loved more than any other. The betrayal was personal and profound. But while the king walked in the garden trying to master his fury, Haman stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life, for he saw that the king had already decided his fate. Haman knew the game was over. The king's body language, his rage, his departure, all signaled that judgment had been pronounced. Haman's only hope was the mercy of the same queen whose people he'd planned to exterminate. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. In his desperation, Haman had apparently thrown himself toward Esther's couch, perhaps falling at her feet to beg for mercy. But in ancient Persian court protocol, approaching the queen too closely, especially physically, was a grave violation. The couch on which she reclined was her space, and for Haman to fall on it crossed boundaries that could be interpreted as assault. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" The Hebrew word can mean assault or force. Xerxes interpreted Haman's desperate plea as a physical attack on the queen in the king's own presence. Whether Haman's action was actually improper, or whether Xerxes was looking for a reason to execute him immediately, the result was the same. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Covering the condemned man's face was Persian custom, a symbol that he was already dead, cut off from the sight of the king and the light of day. The sentence had been pronounced without a formal decree. Haman was finished. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. Harbona, one of the 7 eunuchs who had served Xerxes from the beginning of the story, now provided the perfect solution. The information about the gallows may have come from palace servants who witnessed its construction, or perhaps from the same people Haman had boasted to about his plans. Either way, the irony was about to reach its peak. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. The gallows meant for Mordecai became Haman's execution site. The 75-foot monument to pride became a testimony to divine justice. The instrument built to satisfy wounded ego became the means of judgment. The plot intended to destroy the Jews destroyed their enemy instead. This is divine justice in its purest form, what Scripture calls reaping what you sow. Haman dug a pit for Mordecai and fell into it himself. He cast lots to determine the Jews' destruction and was destroyed on the day of his supposed triumph. The evil he plotted returned on his own head. Then the king's fury subsided. With Haman dead, Xerxes' immediate anger was satisfied. The enemy had been eliminated. Justice had been served, at least partly. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. All of Haman's wealth, property, and possessions were transferred to Esther, the ultimate reversal. The wealth Haman had accumulated, the estate he'd built, the resources he'd gathered, all went to the woman whose people he'd tried to destroy. And Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had told how he was related to her. Finally, Esther revealed what she'd hidden for years. She told the king that Mordecai was her cousin, her guardian, the man who raised her, the one who saved the king's life years earlier. Her Jewish identity was now fully known, and far from being a liability, it elevated Mordecai. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. This moment is staggering. The same signet ring that had sealed the decree of genocide now came to the hand of a Jewish man. The symbol of royal authority that Haman had used to order death now belonged to Mordecai. The power that had been wielded for evil would now be used for good, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. The reversal was complete. The man who sat at the gate now wore the king's ring. The man marked for death now controlled the possessions of his enemy. The intended victim had become the victor, but, and this is crucial, the crisis wasn't over. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Haman was dead. His estate was confiscated. Mordecai wore the ring. But the decree, that terrible edict sealed with the king's signet and sent to every province, remained in effect in less than 9 months. On the 13th of Adar, the law would activate. Throughout 127 provinces, the Jews would face annihilation, and according to Persian and Median law, that decree could not be revoked. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. Even now, even as queen, even after everything, she needed the king to extend grace for her, to approach. "If it pleases the king," she said, "and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" Esther's appeal was passionate and personal. She couldn't stand by and watch her people destroyed. She couldn't bear to see her family annihilated. The problem was legal. How do you override an irrevocable decree? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked." Here was the solution. The original decree couldn't be cancelled because Persian law was absolute. But a new decree could be issued that would effectively counter it. The king gave Mordecai full authority to write whatever he deemed necessary to save the Jewish people. At once, the royal secretaries were summoned. On the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, exactly 70 days after Haman's decree had gone out, a new decree was written. They wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors, and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. These orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language. The inclusion of the Jewish script and language was significant. The first decree had been written to the empire about the Jews. This decree was written to the Jews themselves, empowering them, giving them authority to act. Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers, who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The new decree was comprehensive. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them, and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The language mirrored Haman's decree, but with crucial differences. The Jews weren't commanded to attack. They were given permission to defend themselves. They weren't the aggressors. They were authorized to respond to any who would attack them. The day for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the same day Haman had chosen for their destruction, the same day. What was meant to be the Jews' darkest hour would now be the day they could legally defend themselves and overcome their enemies. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, riding the royal horses, went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. When Mordecai left the king's presence, he was wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold, and a purple robe of fine linen. The contrast with his earlier appearance is stunning. The man who wore sackcloth and ashes now wore royal blue and white. The man who wailed in the streets now wore a large crown of gold. The man who mourned now wore purple robes of fine linen, the colour reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, and the city of Susa held a joyous celebration. For the Jews it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honour. The contrast with chapter 3 is striking. When Haman's decree went out, the city of Susa was bewildered, confused, troubled, disturbed. Now, with Mordecai's decree, the city celebrated. Even the non-Jewish citizens of Susa rejoiced because justice had prevailed and an innocent people had been saved. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating. From India to Ethiopia, across 127 provinces, Jewish communities received the news. The mourning that had gripped them for months gave way to celebration. Fasting turned to feasting. Weeping became rejoicing. Sackcloth was replaced with fine garments. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. This verse is extraordinary. Revival broke out across the empire when people saw God's dramatic intervention, when they witnessed the reversal of fortunes, when they observed how the God of Israel fought for his people. They wanted to become part of that people. Conversions happened throughout the empire. Gentiles chose to identify with the Jews, to worship their God, to join their community. The threat meant to destroy the Jews instead became the catalyst for their faith to spread throughout the known world. But the story wasn't finished yet. The 13th of Adar still loomed on the horizon. The day of reckoning was coming. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The day arrived, the day Haman had selected by casting lots, the day that was supposed to mark the complete annihilation of the Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. But everything had changed. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. Fear had shifted sides. Those who had planned to plunder Jewish homes and kill Jewish families now faced a people authorized by royal decree to defend themselves, and backed by the evident power of their God. The Persian Empire had witnessed too many coincidences: Esther becoming queen at just the right time, Mordecai's loyalty being remembered on just the right night, Haman's plot being exposed at just the right moment. Fear of divine judgment seized those who might have otherwise attacked. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. The government officials who might have turned a blind eye or even encouraged attacks now actively supported the Jewish people. Why? Because Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The man who wore the king's signet ring was Jewish. Opposing the Jews meant opposing Mordecai, and opposing Mordecai meant opposing someone with the king's full backing and authority. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. This wasn't random violence, this was defense against those who hated them. Those who, despite the counter-decree, despite the clear shift in power, despite the fear that gripped the empire, still intended to carry out Haman's genocidal plan. The fact that 75,000 people throughout the empire attacked the Jews that day reveals how widespread and serious the threat had been. Without Esther's courage, without the counter-decree, the Jewish people would have faced slaughter on a massive scale. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Palmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. The text carefully lists all 10 names of Haman's sons. In Jewish tradition, when the Book of Esther is read during Purim, these 10 names are read rapidly in one breath, symbolizing that they all fell together. They had presumably inherited their father's hatred and supported his genocidal plans. All 10 were killed in the fighting. But the Jews did not lay their hands on the plunder. This detail is emphasized repeatedly. Though the decree gave them permission to take the property of their enemies, they refused. This distinction is mentioned 3 times in the chapter, showing that it was a deliberate choice with spiritual significance. This wasn't about wealth or enriching themselves from their enemies' deaths. This was about survival, justice, and defending their right to exist. By refusing the plunder, they demonstrated that their motives were pure. They weren't fighting for personal gain, but for the preservation of their people. This also distinguishes them from King Saul, centuries earlier, who had taken plunder from the Amalekites in disobedience to God's command. Where Saul failed, Mordecai and the Jews showed restraint and obedience. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." Xerxes continued showing extraordinary favor to Esther. Even after everything, the genocide plot, the executions, the conflict, he was still willing to grant additional requests. "If it pleases the king," Esther said, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." Esther requested 2 things: 1 additional day for the Jews in Susa to defend themselves, and the public display of Haman's sons' bodies on poles. The request for an extra day suggests that the threat in Susa hadn't been fully eliminated. The request to display the bodies was both justice and deterrent, a public declaration that enemies of the Jews would not prevail, and a warning to anyone else who might harbor similar intentions. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Again, the text emphasizes their refusal to take plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. 75,000. This staggering number reveals the scale of hatred and danger the Jews faced. Tens of thousands of people throughout the empire had planned to carry out Haman's decree even after his death, even after Mordecai's rise to power, even knowing the Jews were now authorized to defend themselves. Without Esther's intervention, without the counter-decree, the Jewish people would have been massacred on a scale almost unimaginable. And once more, the text emphasizes, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. 3 times this phrase appears, driving home the point that this victory was about preservation, not profit. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. After the battle, after the defense, after the victory, the Jews rested. The 14th of Adar became a day not of continued fighting, but of celebration and thanksgiving. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Because fighting in Susa extended through 2 days, their celebration came a day later. This explains why, to this day, Jews in different locations observe Purim on different dates, the 14th of Adar in most places, the 15th in ancient walled cities like Jerusalem, following the pattern of Susa. That is why rural Jews, those living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. Mordecai established what would become the festival of Purim, named after the pur, the lot that Haman had cast to determine the day of Jewish destruction. What the enemy meant for evil, God transformed into an annual celebration of deliverance. The festival was to commemorate three things: getting relief from enemies, sorrow turned to joy, and mourning turned to celebration. It wasn't just about remembering danger escaped. It was about celebrating the God who turns darkness into light, who transforms mourning into dancing. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another, and gifts to the poor. Purim wasn't just about remembering deliverance personally, it was about celebrating through generosity, sharing food with friends and giving to those in need. Joy was to be communal and inclusive. Even the poor were to experience the celebration, receiving gifts that allowed them to feast as well. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman's had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pur. The very method Haman used to choose the destruction date became the name of the celebration. The lots that were supposed to seal the Jews' fate instead named the festival of their deliverance. Divine irony transformed an instrument of darkness into a symbol of light. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who join them should without fail observe these 2 days every year, in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. This wasn't optional or temporary. This was a binding obligation for all future generations. The memory of this deliverance was too important to fade, the lessons too crucial to forget. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants every generation, every family, every location. Perpetual remembrance. The story would be told again and again, ensuring that no generation of Jews would forget how close they came to extinction, and how God delivered them through the courage of one woman and the faithfulness of one man. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records the festival was officially established, legally documented, and made binding. This wasn't folk tradition or cultural custom. This was decreed by royal authority and recorded in official documents. To this day, over 2,000 years later, Jewish people around the world celebrate Purim every year. They read the Book of Esther aloud in synagogues. When Haman's name is mentioned, they boo, stamp their feet, and use noisemakers called graggers to drown out his name. A reminder that evil may rise, but it will not ultimately prevail. They feast with family and friends. They give mishlosh, manot, gifts of food to each other. They give matanot levionim, monetary gifts to the poor. They celebrate the God who delivered them, who turned their sorrow into joy, who proved faithful even when he seemed silent. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? The Book of Esther concludes by pointing to external historical records. This wasn't myth or legend, this was documented history, recorded in official Persian chronicles that would have been available for verification. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. The orphan girl's cousin, the man who once sat humbly at the gate, the one who refused to bow to Haman, he ended the story as second in command of the entire Persian Empire, and he used his position not for personal glory, but for the good of his people. He spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. This is righteous leadership. Power used to benefit others, position leveraged for protection and blessing. But the deepest truth of Esther's story is found in what's not written, the name that never appears. God is never mentioned in the Book of Esther, not once. Not his name, not his titles, not explicit references to prayer or miracles. Yet his presence saturates every chapter, every verse, every seemingly coincidental turn of events. The timing that placed Esther in the palace exactly when needed. The sleepless night that led the king to honor Mordecai. The moment the chronicles were read, the scepter extended to save Esther's life. The reversal of Haman's plot onto his own head. None of these are attributed to God directly, but all bear unmistakable marks of his providence. The Book of Esther teaches us that God is at work even when he seems silent, even when his name isn't spoken, even when we can't see him or hear him or feel his presence. He is there, moving, working, orchestrating, protecting, delivering. For us today, the message resonates powerfully. When God seems absent, he is present. When his voice seems silent, he is speaking. When his hand seems still, he is working. The question is, will we have faith to see him? Will we have courage to step into the roles he's prepared? Esther could have stayed silent. She could have hidden her identity, enjoyed her crown, and hoped the danger wouldn't touch her. But Mordecai's words changed everything. Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? For such a time as this, those words echo through history, calling every generation to recognize that God positions his people precisely where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there. Your position, your influence, your gifts, your struggles, none of it is random. All of it is providence preparing you for purposes you may not yet understand. The question is, what will you do with it? Will you use your position for yourself, or will you, like Esther, risk everything to fulfill the purpose for which you've been placed? The Book of Esther challenges us to live with courage when facing fear, to trust divine providence when circumstances seem chaotic, and to recognize that our lives are not our own. We've been positioned for purposes greater than ourselves. If you found this journey through Esther's story meaningful, would you help spread the message? Hit that like button so more people can discover this content. Subscribe to Deep Bible Stories so you never miss another deep dive into Scripture where ancient truths speak to modern lives. And please share this video with someone who needs to hear that God is still writing stories of deliverance today. Drop a comment below. What's your for such a time as this moment? Where is God calling you to step out in courage? Remember, you are not here by accident. You are here on purpose, for a purpose. God has positioned you exactly where you are, with the gifts you have, for the work He's prepared for you to do. Until next time, stay blessed, stay bold, and keep diving deep into God's Word. This is where we find not just ancient history, but living truth that transforms lives today.